Everyone, welcome on this Thursday evening. It is a beautiful evening here where I'm at in Western Maryland. Hope it's nice where you are too. And tonight we're going to be diving into dual versus cooperative federalism. I put a little note in the chat box, but if you have anything that you are struggling with around federalism that you would like me to go over tonight, I will make sure that I do that before the night's out. And then at any point, feel free to stop me, and I'll be more than happy to chat with whatever you've got questions on. So here we go. Stream tonight. We got a couple things that we're going to be talking about. This is really the first of a two-part stream. Next week we'll finish off the idea of federalism here. But in this stream, we're really going to be tracing American history as it relates to federalism, and really the first 3/4 of American history. So we'll look at dual federalism as it was in early America, and then how dual federalism changed as a result of the Industrial Revolution and the Progressive Era. And then we'll look at cooperative federalism during the New Deal and the Great Society. And specifically with those, we're going to look at two major public policy programs that you really have to know for this course: Social Security and Medicare. So that's what we've got planned for the next about hour. So here we go. So this cake looks delicious. And I just ate dinner just a little bit ago, and now this makes me really, really hungry for dessert. Okay. But surprise it to me, this cake is a great way to teach federalism. And so tonight, we're going to be talking about how federalism relates to cake. So I'm curious, do any of you know how federalism relates to cake? Maybe your teachers have shared this with you, maybe not. I just made a big cake for my class the other day. Yep, I see marble cake, good. Yep, either a layer or marble cake. Yep, good. So my students the other day, I always make a big marble cake for them with it's an amazing peanut butter whipped topping, and I made them a cookie ice cream cake for our layer cake as we were finishing up federalism. Just a fun little way to think about it. So yeah, I'm going to be referring to layer cake and marble cake tonight as we go through federalism. So let's get started here. So in early America, we had a system called dual federalism, and just in case you're still a little bit confused on what federalism is, remember it's just the division of power between the national and state governments. Okay, so what we're doing here in dual federalism is the idea that the federal government has certain powers and the states have others. Those powers don't overlap. Federal government here, state governments here. They're like two layers, and there's no overlap there. Okay, hence why we compare this to a layer cake, but I'll come back to that. Okay. So really for the first about 200 years of American history, well, really about 150 years of American history, our country existed in dual federalism, where the federal government did certain things and the state governments did other things. So in early America, like the very beginning in the 1790s, we see a lot of evidence of dual federalism. There was a constant debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists at first, or the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, who would replace the Anti-Federalists, over just how much power the federal government should have, because they were very wary of a national government that had so much power. Why? Well, because they just got rid of a king that was kind of tyrannical, and they didn't want to deal with that again. And so they decided that they were a little bit concerned over the number of powers the federal government had during the Constitution, which led to the whole Federalist, Anti-Federalist debate. But it continued after the establishment of the Republic. Okay, so one of the first debates that really happened in regard to dual federalism between the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists was the idea of the creation of a national bank. Okay, so you'll remember in the Constitution from your first unit of the year that the Constitution has in Article 1, Section 8, specific things that Congress is able to do. Okay, like the power to tax, the power to regulate post roads, the power to print and coin money, the power to raise a militia, all those things. But then at the end of that, remember that the Congress has the necessary and proper clause, which says that it can establish laws which are necessary and proper for the nation that, connect to the enumerated powers there in Article 1, Section 8. So, two people in George Washington's cabinet really had differing ideas when it came to the national bank, okay? Thomas Jefferson, who was the Secretary of State and really a Democratic Republican, and Alexander Hamilton, who was the Secretary of the Treasury and was a Federalist. Alexander Hamilton felt that the national bank could be established, okay, and that there wasn't really any problem with that. Although there's nothing about a national bank in Article 1, Section 8, Alexander Hamilton felt that, well, because of the necessary and proper clause, that could be established. Whereas Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans at the time were like, no, not really. You actually have to, that's really a state right and not a federal power, okay? And so there was a heated debate. Now, if you have watched or listened to any of the music from the musical Hamilton, you probably are familiar with this. If not, where are you living under a rock? Because Hamilton is a great way to not only learn U.S. history, early American U.S. history, but some of the stuff that you do in GoPo as well, too. And so, anyways, going on here. So, basically, Washington and Congress ended up siding with Hamilton, and they created the national bank, okay? And so, the reason why this is an example of dual federalism is because the federal government had its own national bank, and the states' governments had their own state banks, okay? Now, we're going to come back to this here with a Supreme Court case, because even though it passes, the Democratic Republicans are not really happy about it. And we get one of your foundational required cases for the AP test, McCulloch versus Maryland. And probably you've talked about this case in class. So I'm going to give you the quick rundown here. There's the picture of the National Bank in Baltimore. So in Maryland was one of those states where they really weren't happy with the federal government creating a national bank. So Maryland passed a law taxing the National Bank's Baltimore branch, okay, about $15,000 a year. Now, that's a heck of a lot of money today. That's an incredible amount of money back in the early 1800s. So basically, the reason Maryland decided to do that was because they weren't really a fan of the idea of the national bank. And they said, well, if it's going to exist here, we're going to tax it. We're going to make some money off of it. So the tax collector basically came, and one of the tellers at the bank, whose last name was McCulloch, refused to make that payment. He refused to pay the state of Maryland. So that case ended up making its way all the way to the Supreme Court. And so basically, Maryland was making the argument that the federal government does not have the right to establish a national bank. It's not listed anywhere in the Constitution, and it's especially not one of the enumerated powers in Article 1, Section 8. So the Supreme Court heard their concerns. They heard the side of McCulloch. And basically, the Supreme Court said a couple things. Number one, they said that because of the supremacy clause of the Constitution, that the national government was supreme over the states. And thus, a state can't tax the federal government, okay? The federal government is higher than the state governments, okay? And it is supreme because the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. So the federal government is supreme, and if the federal government decides to pass a law that's constitutional, of course, well, then it gets to stay, okay? And a state can't overturn that. So the second thing that the court said was that, listen, the federal government has implied powers that go beyond its enumerated power, basically reaffirming that necessary and proper clause. So while the bank was this really big debate, it ends up staying. Okay, now you might be thinking, well, I don't think we have a national bank today. You're correct. It goes away later in American history. If you take an A-push, you'll talk about, or you've talked about Andy Jackson killing the bank in the 1830s. Oh, excuse me. Man. And anyways, we have a national bank today, but you know it as something different. It's called the Fed. It's a little bit different than how the national bank operated back then, okay? So as we keep on going with dual federalism here, some other quick examples of dual federalism in early America: the Whiskey Rebellion, also during the presidency of George Washington. Basically, what the United States government had done was they had passed an excise tax, okay, on whiskey distillers. Okay, now why would they pass this tax on whiskey distillers? Well, think about it. The government likes to tax things that people enjoy, okay, like, or need, okay? So, for example, like if you guys drive, you know that gas prices are high. Well, part of that is because of government taxing. But the government also taxes pretty heavily alcohol, cigarettes, things like that, okay? And so, anyways, back in the 1790s, the federal government passed a tax on whiskey. Well, farmers in Western Pennsylvania, actually just north of where I live here in Western Maryland, decided to basically say, we're not paying that tax, okay, and rised up. Well, President Washington, being the military general that he was, actually summoned the militia and rallied 13,000 soldiers to put down that rebellion. In fact, the little town that I live in called Cumberland is a little bit famous for that because he comes here to Cumberland to gather the troops because like we're not far from Western Pennsylvania. And anyways, basically they marched the troops to Western Pennsylvania, but when they got there, the rebellion had settled. But it was once again another way that the federal government showed, look, we are supreme over the states. There are certain things that we can do because the Constitution allows it, and there are certain things that you can do. Taxing whiskey is one of those things. And then the next thing that comes about is once President Washington decides he's not going to run for a third term and retires, John Adams is elected to the president, who's also a very strong Federalist. And he ends up passing with Congress the Alien and Sedition Acts, okay, which basically empowered the government to jail any dissenters against the government and deport foreigners who posed a threat to the United States. Now, basically, the way this was used was anybody that spoke out against the Federalist Party somehow ended in jail, okay? And the reason they didn't really like foreigners was because a lot of times those foreigners ended up registering as like Democratic Republicans. And so Jeffersonians felt that once again, or Democratic Republicans, we also call them Jeffersonians, felt that once again, this is like a real abuse here of the federal government's power. But again, the idea of two separate spheres, the federal government being on top, the states on another, and the federal government supreme. So if it says it can do something, then it can do it. Now, that being said, and I know we haven't got to civil rights and civil liberties yet for probably most of you this year, but it probably was just a little bit unconstitutional, the Alien Sedition Act. But it was never challenged in the Supreme Court during that time. So here are some good examples of dual federalism, okay? Transportation is your best examples, especially in the early 1800s. So one of the things that the federal government did around transportation in the early 1800s was build the national road. Now, why is the federal government involved in the national road? Well, because it needed to be something that was intrastate, okay? So it went, interstate. So it went between states, okay? Which states wouldn't be able to do that, okay? Because they can only control in their border. And B, a project like the National Road in the early 1800s requires a lot of money that most states don't have. And so the federal government said, okay, well, we're going to build this national road because not only is it going to help the country because of the trade that will result, but it will end up helping all of these states that exist between Maryland and Illinois, where the national road ends up going to. The other thing the federal government starts to put money into and build are canals, really for the same reason. They're trying to boost transportation so that trade can increase and so that the economy can do better in those places. And again, it's the idea that many of these canals would cross state borders, and states just didn't have the money to build the canals themselves. So national roads and canals are great examples of dual federalism because they're things that the national government would do. Meanwhile, the states are doing all the other things that aren't listed in the Constitution, that 10th Amendment reserved power. So dual federalism continues for a while, okay? And the way that we think of dual federalism is like a layer cake, okay? Because at one layer, you have the federal government, and at another layer, you have the state governments, okay? So we then move to a period of cooperative federalism in the United States. But before I go to cooperative federalism, I just want to make sure that you understand dual federalism. So do any of you need any more examples, or are you good with dual federalism? Do you have more questions on dual federalism? Because I don't want to move on to cooperative if you're still struggling with dual federalism. So I'll give you a second here. If you have something that you need me to cover or to give better examples for, to type it in the chat box. Yeah, no problem. Transportation, like if you're looking for examples with dual federalism, transportation is always a good one. Okay, and if you think about it, that still is kind of true today. Depending on where you live, you probably have interstate highways that run through your area. So, for example, I'll answer the Hoover Dam thing here in just 1 second. For example, I don't live very far from an interstate that's called Interstate 81. Well, Interstate 81 runs basically from the deep south, okay, all the way up into, I want to say Massachusetts, maybe even Maine, okay? That's an interstate highway system. So that was built by the federal government. Why? Because it crossed multiple states, okay? And it really wasn't something that state governments did. So the federal government handled that. And really, Article 1, Section 8 talks about the federal government building post roads and things like that. So it makes sense that excuse me, I'm losing my voice, that the federal government would do that. Okay, so Ashley, in terms of your question on the Hoover Dam, not the Hoover Dam, okay? But I'm actually going to mention the Hoover Dam here in a minute, because the Hoover Dam is actually an example of cooperative federalism, and in just a minute you'll get an idea as to why that is, okay? So we move from a period of dual to cooperative federalism, okay? And before really I get into examples of cooperative federalism, I want to explain really what it is, okay? So with cooperative federalism, we compare it to a marble cake because there's a mixing of state and national powers there. Some of the things that cooperative federalism involves includes shared costs, okay? Meaning that state and local governments pick up part of the bill. So, for example, with the Hoover Dam, it's a New Deal project under FDR in the 1930s during the Great Depression. The federal government pays a chunk of that bill, especially the workers and things like that. But the states of Nevada and Arizona also picked up part of that tab to build that. Hence why it's considered cooperative federalism. The federal government kicks in part, the states kick in part. Another part of cooperative federalism are federal guidelines. So most federal grants to state and local government come with strings attached. Like in order to get money for highways, states have to adopt limits on legal drinking age, okay? So you probably have talked about grants in your classes. We'll talk more about grants in a stream next week on the second half of federalism when we start to talk about devolution and the devolving of power back to the states, especially under Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. But a lot of that's done through grants, okay? So with cooperative federalism, a lot of times the federal government will give grants of money to the states, but they have to do certain things to get that grant money. Okay, so for example, the federal government gives billions and billions and billions of dollars out every year in highway funding. Okay, but in order for the states to take up that highway funding, they have to have the minimum drinking age of 21. It is basically the federal government's way of regulating something that it doesn't have the power to regulate. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say it can set a drinking age. You really can't imply that from any of the enumerated powers. So it's not really something that falls under the necessary and proper clause. So the federal government says, well, we have a vested interest in making sure that The drinking age is at 21. And so the way we'll get states to do that is we'll say, hey, you don't get your highway funding if you set your drinking age below 21. There was a state just recently, and I cannot remember which one it was, that was talking about lowering the drinking age to, I want to say, 18, okay? And the federal government said, well, that's fine, you can do that, but you won't get any more money from us for highways. And that basically ended that talk, okay? So your question, Ashley, about why doesn't the federal government make it a mandate then? Basically, it is a mandate, okay? As a part of the grants that states get for highway funding, there are certain things that they have to do, okay? And one of those mandates or strings is the 21 drinking age, okay? So that's really why they're doing that, okay? And then the last part about cooperative federalism is really their shared administration. So the federal government takes or gives some money and the states administer the money or have some latitude in spending it, okay? So the states do some pieces of it and the federal government does some piece of it. Hence why we're calling this like cooperative or marble cake federalism. So let's talk about how this comes about and get some examples here. So really what brings about the switch from dual federalism to cooperative federalism is the Industrial Revolution, okay? So during the Industrial Revolution, you start to get all this big business, okay, which can be regulated by Congress because it's commerce, and you have the Commerce Clause in Article 1, Section 8. And basically, there's a lot of business practices that people aren't really happy about. A good example of that would be like child labor, okay? People were not happy that industries were hiring small children, some who were dying in the factories, to work in them. So people called out to the federal government when the states couldn't regulate these things or wouldn't regulate them. They called out to the federal government and said, hey, you have to stop this terrible practice. Another example, during the Industrial Revolution, if you take APUSH, you'll talk about a book by Upton Sinclair in the early 1900s called The Jungle. Basically, he did this investigative report, and he found all these disgusting practices they were doing in this meat packing factory in Chicago. Things like putting out rat poison on the floor, and then the rats would die, and then the next day to clean up the mess, they just shovel all the rat and the rat poison and just dump it in the sausage. Men would constantly lose their fingers in the meat grinding process. They wouldn't clean out the machine, and they just let the finger go through. And so, you know, what you thought was a Vienna sausage was actually someone's finger, and like disgusting things like this. And I'm really sorry if you're sitting there eating dinner right now. I should have warned you for that because the whole thing is disgusting. But things like that made people during the progressive era, the early 1900s, really call out for reform that of all of these issues that were being caused by the Industrial Revolution. And so voters started to put reformers into office, both at the state level and the federal level. And they wanted to see these people clean up the railroads, the factories, and corrupt government. And so as the nation grew and citizens became more mobile, meaning they were moving from place to place, our problems began to travel across state borders, okay? And so as a result, the federal government had to start taking action, okay? So the federal government passed a law on child labor, okay? We passed a law on the Food and Drug Act that required, safe handling of not only food, but medicine. And then we established a law enforcement agency, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, to regulate and enforce the laws that are there. So we start to get a blend of things that used to be just state powers and in their state layer, that were not federal powers, and now the federal government is kind of blending those, okay? Hence why we call this cooperative federalism. The federal government's now regulating child labor. The federal government's now in the business of law enforcement with the FBI. The federal government's now enforcing food standards. Those are things that before were really state powers, and now the federal government is changing that. So if your teacher would ask you, like, what causes the shift from dual to cooperative federalism, really, it's the Industrial Revolution and the ideas of the progressive era. So our best example of cooperative federalism comes as a result of the Great Depression that starts in 1929 and the subsequent New Deal program of FDR. So in 1929, the greatest economic disaster in U.S. history occurred when the stock market crashed in October of that year. Altogether, 25% of Americans ended up losing their jobs. Many would lose all of their money when their entire life savings ended up really just disappearing because the banks collapsed and closed. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR, as he's known, comes to office. And he promised to get the country out of the Depression through a series of legislative acts, which he called the New Deal. Okay? This, I cannot express to you how important it is to understand the New Deal and the Great Society, two huge government programs, of which you will definitely see on the test, okay? So I'm going to take some time now to explain those programs. So the New Deal did a variety of things, okay? It hired men to do construction projects like building schools and dams, okay? They hired teenage boys to do conservation projects, okay? They encouraged farmers to cut back on overproduction of food and regulating banks to ensure that the disaster that occurred would never happen again. So basically, why the New Deal is such a great example of cooperative federalism is because the federal government now is throwing money at things that they never had thrown money at before and getting involved in things that they never had gotten involved in before, basically to try to get the country out of this Great Depression that we were in. So a perfect example is education. Nowhere in the Constitution does it talk about the federal government having any powers when it comes to the Constitution. But yet, I just sat here and told you that in the New Deal, they did a variety of things, including hiring men to do construction projects like building schools. Guess what? The school that I teach in was built during the New Deal as a project of the federal government. Okay, so literally my classroom was built in 1935 by a New Deal project. This map that you see here on your screen, this is all of the New Deal projects across the United States. Okay, so you can see there were a ton of projects that the federal government basically funded and helped the states out. And the states would accept that funding. Why? Because they wanted to get their people out of work too. They wanted to improve their economy. The Hoover Dam is a New Deal project, okay? So now you've got all this mixing between the federal and the state governments, especially with the New Deal here, because the federal government's getting involved into all of these things that it never really did before, and technically, via the Constitution, doesn't really have the power to do, but the states weren't going to challenge them on that because the states were desperate for money and for these programs to get people back to work. So that's the New Deal. Now, one of the programs of the New Deal that you must know for the AP test is the Social Security program, okay? And I'm going to just briefly talk about it here. Why? Because it's another example of cooperative federalism. So amid the Great Depression, FDR and his advisors created a federal safety net for elderly and supported those who were put out of work. And this program that they created was called Social Security, okay? So prior to the New Deal, if you were poor and you were looking for assistance, or you were out of work and you were looking for assistance, you wouldn't look to the federal government because they wouldn't have anything to do with that. You'd look to the charities in your town and then maybe your state if you were lucky. Well, FDR changes that when we pass the Social Security Act, okay? Because now the Social Security Act that's passed in 1935 as a part of the New Deal program basically created an insurance program that required all persons who were employed to pay a small contribution via payroll tax into an insurance fund basically designed to assist the unemployed and help financially strapped retirees. So as a result, today and back then, at the age of 65, you start to collect a Social Security check from the federal government, okay? Now, the longer you wait to collect that Social Security check, the more that Social Security check will be for, okay? it automatically comes out of your paycheck. So if you have a job right now, even if it's just like working somewhere like fast food or something like that, then you're automatically getting that Social Security taken out. It goes into a giant pot, okay? And that giant pot that the federal government has of all of our money, you don't have an individual account, okay? It all goes into one giant pot. That's what they use to pay out all of the people who are 65 or older who are collecting Social Security. Now, back when they passed this program, that wasn't a big deal because very few people made it to 65, and if they did, they didn't live much longer after that. Today, 65 is quite young, okay? Almost everyone makes it to 65. The average life expectancy in the United States is like 77, 78. So people are living quite some time. The other thing is, after World War II, we had the baby boom. So you had all these baby boomers who were born, all of which are now getting ready to retire or already have retired. So there's tons of them pulling money out of the Social Security program, okay? Well, that's kind of a problem, okay, because there's not enough of you and I, younger people, paying into that program. And as a result, that program will end up drying up within our lifetime unless the federal government fixes it. So my question to you is, and maybe you've talked about this with your teachers, how does the federal government fix Social Security then? If we're worried that it's going to dry up before you and I ever get to it, how do they fix it? What would you suggest the federal government does to fix Social Security? I'm going to give you a second to plug in your answers here. So I see one answer. Any other thoughts? So raising the age is really the answer here. So what Ashley wrote, raising the age from like 65 to 75, yeah, you're not wrong. So we know that, okay? We know the age of Social Security has to be raised, okay? So why doesn't the federal government do it? We've known that the age has to be raised for the last 20, 30 years that we've discussed a need to fix the program. So why doesn't the federal government do it? Anybody have any ideas? Because of this. Who votes? Older people, okay? The biggest group that shows up to vote on election day are people who are 65 years of age and older. And members of Congress don't want to lose their jobs, okay? And they know that if they tick off the older people who are the most likely to vote and who have a very powerful interest group called the American Association of Retired Persons, or AARP, they very well could lose their job. And most congressmen are not interested in losing their job in Congress. So eventually something will have to be done, okay? Because otherwise you and I are not going to ever get any Social Security. But Social Security is a program that's created out of the New Deal. It gives persons who are retired 65 and older a small check each month. It's not meant for you to completely live off of. You have to have your own retirement savings too, but to help you with your expenses. Now, it also helps the blind and poor people, okay? It also helps those two groups as well too, but that's kind of like a separate thing. But again, this is an example of going back to cooperative federalism because the federal government's getting involved in something that really the states had only done prior to this, or local charities, and now they're getting involved. So our next great example of cooperative federalism was the Great Society under my absolute very favorite president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, or as we just call him, LBJ. So LBJ comes to the presidency in 1963 after JFK is assassinated. And he institutes a program. He really looked up to FDR and the New Deal. He institutes his own program of laws, and it's called the Great Society. The main goals of the Great Society were to end poverty, to reduce crime in the United States, abolish inequality, and improve the environment. Those are the four big things that LBJ wanted to accomplish as a part of the Great Society. So he starts passing laws and programs just like FDR did with Congress's help and assistance to see his goals come about. one of his biggest parts of the Great Society was the war on poverty, okay? And so he wanted to figure out ways that where we could reduce poverty in the United States. And he's actually successful in bringing down the number of people who live in poverty during that time. One of the programs that they created was the Job Corps for 100,000 disadvantaged men. Half would work on conservation projects like in national forests and things like that. And the other would receive skills and training and special job training centers. Why? Because then they would be able to have the training to go out and get a good paying job and hopefully get themselves out of poverty. This is an example of cooperative federalism because this is the federal government stepping into something that the states had traditionally done in the past. But the states aren't stopping them here because the states have a vested interest in also wanting their people to be employed. So if the federal government wants to spend their money that way, they can. Another big area that LBJ works on as a part of the Great Society is education. Okay, he creates Head Start, a program that's still around to this day. Maybe you have a Head Start in your school. Okay, Head Start is a pre-K program for children whose families otherwise couldn't afford to send their kid to pre-K. And we know the huge benefits of pre-K on a kid's learning, and thus LBJ establishes that. Education's not mentioned in the Constitution. There's no federal power to education. That's a state reserved power. Well, here the federal government's getting involved. And then they also passed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which today it's been reauthorized once during your lifetime as No Child Left Behind, and then secondly, as the Every Student Succeeds Act. But this is when it was first passed, as the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. That guaranteed federal funding to school districts whose student majority was low income. And so that, again, is another example of cooperative federalism and how the federal government's getting involved with things that traditionally the states had in the past. So one of the major Great Society programs that's important for you to understand as a AP Gov student is Medicare and Medicaid. So FDR really had wanted to pass the National Health Insurance Program too, and he couldn't. Harry Truman comes along, and he really wants to, and he couldn't. JFK comes along, and he really wanted to, and he couldn't. Finally, LBJ is the one who's able to get Congress to pass the Medicare law in 1965. Basically, it's similar to Social Security, but it helps persons who are over 65 with their Medicare costs, okay? Their medical costs. Now, it's not your sole insurance. You still have whatever insurance you have from retirement. But Medicare will help you with your doctor bills, your prescription medicine, and all of that, okay? Just like with Social Security, you and I pay for it over time by coming out of our paycheck, okay? And just like Social Security, that pot is also coming to an end as well too. And if they don't fix that, you and I aren't going to have Medicare when we get there, okay? Medicare can cover up to about 80% of your health care costs when you're 65 or older, okay? Now, that's why you still need to have your own insurance, which a lot of people do through whatever organization they retired from. Now, the other program that's passed as a part of all of this is Medicaid. Medicaid provides health insurance to people who are in poverty in the United States, okay? You have to meet a minimum income threshold to be able to get it, or be disabled or pregnant to get Medicaid in the United States. And Medicaid insurance is health insurance, but you can be any age, whether you're 2 years old or whether you're 60 years old. It doesn't matter that you're not old enough for Medicare yet. With Medicaid, as long as you meet those income requirements, then you can get those benefits. So once again, another example of cooperative federalism. Health insurance, not mentioned in the Constitution. It's a reserved power for the states, but yet the federal government gets involved with it. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily a bad thing, okay? I mean, you can make all sorts of arguments here. Libertarians would say this is government overstep. It's too large of a federal government. And Republicans would probably say the same thing. But these are programs that have had an incredible impact on American history and are great examples of cooperative federalism. So we think of cooperative federalism like a marble cake, okay? Because the federal government and the state governments are kind of intermixing. And when you get that essay question or when your teacher talking about it, go straight to the New Deal, go straight to the Great Society, use those programs like Social Security and Medicare to boost your answer here. So that's basically it for cooperative versus dual federalism. I put up the list of upcoming things, but just real quick before I finish tonight, I want to make sure that you don't have any other questions on cooperative versus dual federalism or anything maybe I didn't explain too well that you want me to go into a little bit more. So I'm just going to wait here a minute just to see if anybody has any comments on anything. And also I'll throw out there, is there something that you want us to stream on, a topic you want us to stream on in the next week or so that could help you? Please put that there. So I'll just kind of give you guys a minute here to put in any responses of questions or suggestions that you have. Yeah, can I explain why the New Deal's cooperative federalism? Yeah, that's not a problem at all. The same as the Great Society, okay? Because now with cooperative federalism and programs like the New Deal, the federal government's getting involved in programs that only the states would have in the past. So, for example, the New Deal, part of its goal was to get people back to work, because during the Great Depression, 25% of the people, 1 in 4 people, didn't have a job. Well, getting people back to work and things like building roads and bridges and schools and dams were things that only the states did before, not the national government. But the states were broke during the Great Depression. The federal government had money. So the federal government said, we will step in and we will help you to build schools, we'll help you to build dams, we'll help you to put these conservation programs into place. We'll give you the money for them, you need to administer them. So it's a mixing of the federal versus the state government. So does that help you in terms of understanding why the New Deal is an example of cooperative federalism? Okay, good. Any other questions or topics you would like us to stream on? Okay, then. Well, I don't see anything else coming up. We've got another stream happening here in just a couple of minutes on the Constitutional Convention. If you guys have questions, one of my colleagues will be doing that one. Oh, it should be good. And then there's a bunch of other great, helpful ones coming up. Thanks for tuning in tonight, guys. It is almost Friday. Enjoy your last day of school for the week and the weekend. Have a good night, guys. Bye.